Okay, what we're going to be doing now, this is part two, and I know not all of you were here last week, so we're going to do a brief review. And as I shared last week, this is kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant. I've shared with you before that I had a professor that once said, "Gentlemen, today is drinking from a fire hydrant," and he gave us the tip of this to drink fast. Okay, so you're going to have to drink fast. You're going to have to sit up in your chair, lean forward, open the ears, and take it all in. I'm going to throw a lot at you. And the stuff I threw at you last week, we're going to review briefly, and then we're going to let that cement a little bit, and we're going to keep on going here. So we are here to talk about same-sex marriage. We live in a same-sex marriage culture, a same-sex marriage environment. The ethics are around us, and so the challenge for us as the church is to understand what is going on, and as we understand what is going on, then to learn a proper and compassionate yet response of integrity to this situation in our culture and with those around us. Okay, so we're covering here the very first part. There's three parts we're covering. The very first part is going to be the philosophy, what's going on philosophically. Then we're going to talk about the theology, so what is going on with those that try to adhere to same-sex marriage simultaneously while holding to the Christian faith. So what is going on theologically would be number two. And then number three is going to be impact. But today, we're looking at the second part of the philosophy, what's going on behind the scenes, what is going on beneath the surface, what are the presuppositions at work, what philosophical tectonic plates are in play and in movement. So we're going to do a brief review. Last week, we covered something called nihilism. Can you guys say nihilism? Nihilism. Then we covered Platonic ideology. Okay, not Plato, okay? We covered Platonic ideology. And then today we're going to cover ethical hedonism. Now, as I shared last week, these are big words, okay? Don't get lost in the bigness of the words. You know, you can put them in your pocket. You can save them for conversation to impress your friends. When we look at these words, I want you to understand the meaning and what is going on with these words. So you'll see these prevalent in all aspects of our society. So, brief review, nihilism. Nihilism comes from the Latin word, and as I shared last week, I'm not an expert in Latin, so it's either nihil or nihil, which means nothing. Okay, so nihilism comes from this idea of nothing. And this philosophy ideology teaches that traditional morals, right, traditional ideas, traditional beliefs, and so forth, have no worth or value in our present culture. Okay, traditional values, morals, ideas, and beliefs have no value, and this nihilism teaches that we cannot resolve the answer to the most basic questions of life, for there's no such thing as an objective truth. Life does not have an objective meaning, for it does not have a final destiny. So nihilism says you cannot make judgments of right and wrong. You don't know what is objectively true because there's no such thing as an objective standard. There's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as an objective whole truth that we can lean upon. So then truth, right, is up to who? The individual. Whatever you think goes, right? Because there's no objective authority outside of yourself. So nihilism, and we covered last week a bunch of examples in the culture where nihilism is rejecting the subjective truth. And like I said, I wish we had time to go through that, but we got to keep on plowing forward. I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, I taped this last week, and it's online with the slides on YouTube, so you can watch through it and see all the examples of nihilism. Okay? So let's move on. And I know we're moving quite fast here, but we have to get to our new material. So real quick here, nihilism, rejected. See here we have this deistic religions. We have God and the sacred up above, and we have mankind below. We have a two-tiered kind of approach. We have the sacred above us and mankind below. And nihilism rejects God and the sacred, leaving us with mankind. Briefly now, Platonism. Okay, like I said, we're going to go through this fast because we got to get to our other material. Platonism, very simply, Plato, he saw existence in two different spheres or realms. He understood things from a material realm and a transcendent realm. Okay, so for Plato, he held that which was true and perfect and right was the spiritized realm. Okay, And on the other side, he held to things that were material. So in other words, he separated into body and soul. He ended up separating spiritized things with material things. And here's what's interesting. As he divided that out, okay, what he ended up doing is showing that material things were what? Bad. They were insufficient. They were not worthy to be on the same level as things that were spiritual. And so as we look at our culture with many different things, we see that the material side is bad, spiritual things are good, spiritized things are good. So what rules? What rules? The soul rules. The emotions and the soul of the person rules over the biology of the person. So it doesn't matter what biology says, it's the soul that's number one. Okay? All right, so nihilism and Platonism, we see nihilism here. It diminishes God and the sacred, leaving mankind, then it separates mankind into body and soul, and then it diminishes what? The body. And we're left with the soul. Okay, we're going to talk about something called ethical hedonism. Okay, that's a big fancy word, but ethical hedonism. What is ethical hedonism? Ethical hedonism is the idea that all people have the right to do everything in their power to achieve the greatest amount of pleasure possible to them, assuming that their actions do not infringe on the equal rights of others. It is also the idea that every person's pleasure should far surpass their amount of gain. Hedonism teaches this. Hedonism teaches this first part, that you need to do whatever it is to make you happy. Ethical hedonism adds this little bit of a contingent factor that says you can do everything you want to make you happy as long as it doesn't what? Infringe on other people's values and so forth, okay? Assuming that their actions do not infringe on the equal rights of others. So in other words, hedonism says that the goal of life is to be happy and to have pleasure. The ethical part says as long as you don't infringe and hurt your neighbor. That makes sense? So what we've done here last week, what I did with nihilism was to show that there's a rejection of authority, rejection above us, right? And then we talked about Platonism, where there's a rejection of the biology. The effects of Platonism is the rejection of the biology. So then what we've done is we kind of opened up the can of worms that there's no sense of anything that unifies us. And we almost have a chaos, and we cannot live as human beings in that chaotic structure. So there has to be something that pulls us along, and what pulls us along as a culture is this. What the goal then of mankind becomes is pleasure and happiness. Okay? You guys tracking with me? So let's give a couple examples of this. Here's a meme. I don't know if you're familiar with memes. Memes are little pictures with words that are put on social media. This is one that just basically from a very basic Google search you could find. It says this: never be ashamed of what you feel. You have the right, look at that, you have the right to feel any emotion that you want and to do what makes you happy. Okay? What is that? That's hedonism. Hedonism at work in our culture. Okay? So like I said, our culture has rejected the authority, any authority above us. Sexually speaking, our culture, as the effects of Platonism, has rejected the biology, what biology says about how humankind works. And then to unify all this kind of chaos together, we have this hedonism in place that says, well, now all that said, there must be a goal in life, and that goal in life is to be happy. And according to this meme, you have the right to feel whatever you want, and you have the right to do what makes you happy. Miley Cyrus. You guys know who Miley Cyrus is? Hannah Montana, right, was what she was on Disney Channel. Miley Cyrus is very, very much in the news right now. We'll have to endure her for a little bit longer, and like most artists, she will have her place of fame for a while, and then as time goes on, she'll be forgotten. That's just the reality of what happens with musicians that go the route that she does. And here's what she says. She says, God wants my life to be about being successful and being happy. And she goes on to say, as long as you're not hurting anyone, she says, your choices are your choices. What is that? That's ethical hedonism. Okay, you see what her goal is? God, she actually appeals to God, which is very, very fascinating. She appeals to God. She says that God wants my life to be happy and successful. And then she goes on to say, as long as you're not hurting anyone, your choices are your choices. That's an example of ethical hedonism. She goes on to say, and this is in another magazine called The Paper Magazine, she says this, I'm literally open to every single thing that is consenting and doesn't involve an animal, and everyone is of age. She told Paper Magazine, everything that's legal, I'm down with. I'm down with any adult, anyone over the age of 18 who is down to love me. What is she talking about? Sexual relations. This is her sexual ethics. Okay? So you see, her sexual ethics are even ruled by, and you have a little bit of information here that's kind of interesting. Anyone that's consenting, because if they're not consenting, then it's what? It's violating their happiness, right? Everyone who's of age. Now that's interesting. She is respecting the authority of age, right? Because anything underneath 18 would be statutory rape. But I would say that that is more so to do with protecting who? Her happiness from the law. Okay? Everything that's legal, see, I'm down with. I'm down with any adult, anyone over the age of 18 who is down to what? Love me. Okay? Here's another meme. Look at this here. Everyone has the right, you keep on seeing that, the word right? Everyone has the right to be happy. Now this is interesting, without feeling guilty. Okay? So what is this pointing out? This is actually this hedonism at work as well as feeling guilty. What is that rejecting? That's the effects of nihilism. It's rejecting anything outside of me, any authority of condemning me. So I have the right to be happy without any authority or anything above me, apart from me, that would cause me to feel guilty. Okay? So that's ethical, that's hedonism at work along with nihilism. Okay? Here's this one. This one's great. I'd far rather be happy than right any day. What do we see at work there? Happiness is then our highest ideal. We see this in culture. So our culture has rejected the authority of something above us, right? Rejected the sacred, rejected the authority above. As we covered last week with Platonism, it rejects the ideology of what the body says about itself. Okay? And then here we see that the ideal that's being held up as the standard of what governs our society is happiness and pleasure, as long as it does not impact other people. And when we look at this happiness, then it should be free from guilt from something outside of us, and it doesn't matter whether or not you are right, okay, as long as you are happy. Okay? Okay, any questions so far? Yes, Wayne. Okay, yep. So that's a good question. So who determines what is happy? So if there's no sense of an objective standard to define happiness, who defines happiness? Happiness is up to the individual. Now here's that's great. Hold that thought. Wayne, you're right on. Let's look at this one here. This is another slide here. This is from Howard Stern and Ellen DeGeneres. I don't know if you're familiar with Howard Stern. He has a radio program. And Ellen DeGeneres is a talk show host, okay? And she herself, I believe she's married. I'm not quite sure the gal that she's married to, but she is a lesbian. And they're on the show, on his interview show, with Howard Stern. Ellen DeGeneres says this about Bruce and Bruce Caitlyn Jenner, right? However you want to say, the gentleman who went through the sex change. Well, he didn't really go through a sex change totally. I think it's kind of in between, is my understanding. And here's what Ellen says about Jenner. I don't really know her, and I'm trying to understand it because I don't fully understand it either. But I also want everyone to be happy. I want her to be happy, which is what I want for her and me. Okay? With that said, DeGeneres' comments exemplify what governs America's ethics and reasoning: happiness. Otherwise stated, and this goes to Wayne's question, things don't have to make sense as long as happiness prevails. So what defines happiness? It doesn't matter objectively or logically as long as you are happy. So what happens when your happiness collides with another person's happiness? Well, that's what's going on in our culture right now. Okay? Okay, this is what's going on right here. Check this out. This is an anonymous social media comment. This is from a person on social media. And this person says, I am straight, and I believe that anyone who wants to be happy should have that right. You see what I'm saying? Happiness has become a right in our culture. So this person who's straight believes that anyone who wants to be happy should have that right. I do not believe that anyone has the right to tell anyone who they can be married to. So you have the right to be happy, but you do not have the right to impose an objective standard upon somebody else, because that would go against our nihilistic culture. Okay? If two males want to be married and they are happy, let them marry. If two women want to be married and they are happy, let them. Who are you and who gave you permission to make arrangement on anyone's life? What's going on there? Isn't that nihilism? Okay, all right. The grammar here is kind of neat. It don't matter who you are. I believe anyone is entitled to have the same rights as any straight person. They are no different than we are, and they need to be treated with the same rights as us. If you were in love, do you believe you'd need someone's permission to get married and to be happy? So what is governing our society right now? So we, like I said, we have this breakdown of the authority above us. We have the breakdown of understanding how biology works, and we covered last week how the biology works, a male and female making babies. I mean, that is diminished, right? And now we are coming into this culture where what holds this all together? It's happiness. And as we saw in some of these slides, happiness should be free from guilt. It should be free from reason, okay? And it does not have to make sense as long as you are happy. I'm not advocating for this, okay? Wayne. Which comes back to nihilism, right? That's from last week, the nihilism. We reject the authority because an objective standard would define to us what is right and what's wrong. And an objective source, such as God, would say, I don't care if you're not happy, right? This is right and this is wrong. And it doesn't depend on your happiness, okay? All right, let's plow along here. For more, we're going to back up here. I'm getting ahead of myself. How does this work with the Declaration of Independence? You've heard a lot about rights. You have a right to be happy. You have a right to be happy. You have a right to be happy. Now, we're often in these conversations, I've seen brought up the Declaration of Independence where it says the pursuit of happiness gets brought up. So let's just cover this a little bit here. The right to the pursuit of happiness affirmed in the Declaration of Independence is taken these days to affirm a right to chase after whatever makes one subjectively happy. Further, the Declaration doesn't guarantee the right to happiness, the thought usually goes, but only the right to pursue what makes you happy. But this reading of the Declaration's pursuit of happiness is wrong on both scores. Happiness in public discourse of the time when the Declaration of Independence was written often did not simply refer to a subjective emotional status. It meant prosperity or, perhaps better, well-being in the broader sense. It included the right to meet physical needs, but it also included a significant moral and religious dimension. So, the pursuit of happiness means something like occupying one's life with the activities that provide for overall well-being. This certainly includes a right to material things, but it goes beyond that to include humanity's spiritual and moral condition. It means a whole lot different than the way it's being used today. Okay? Yep. 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 I'm mainly appealing to this because it's brought up many times, that even this as a basis of authority is misconstrued at best. I agree. I absolutely agree. Yep. Yep, I absolutely agree. Okay? So I have a sheet and I'll hand out afterwards, and I wrote this, I don't know if you guys saw in the Sergeant Teller this week, I wrote an article called Joy, Not Happiness. Okay? And so that was in reflecting on what we're talking about here. So that's in the Teller, so I'll hand this out afterwards. I've been taught if you hand it out during the presentation, then people will read it. Okay? So we'll save it for the very end for you guys, okay? Not that I don't trust you, right? Okay? So now how does ethical hedonism conflict with traditional marriage vows? Think about that. So when you stand before the altar to get married, you said something such as this, right? John Doe, will you have this woman to be your wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy will, and I pledge to you my faithfulness. How does ethical hedonism conflict with our marriage vows? Believe it or not, I've been asked in the past, I've done quite a few weddings in the last 10 plus years as a pastor, and I've been asked many times by bride and grooms, they wanted to write their own marriage vows, okay? And I've said, well, you can submit it to me, you can submit it to me. And there's been a couple times where I've let them say what they want to say. I've been a little bit, maybe a little too lax, but I let them say what they want to say. This was in the previous denomination I was a part of. And then I would say, well, we're going to stick with this. But 9 times out of 10, you know what was left out in the marriage vows that they would write? To death do us part, for better was in there, but the worse, richer, poor, the poor. All the negatives were what? Left out. Okay? Right? And you guys are laughing, right? But the reality is, marriage, okay, look at this. How does ethical hedonism conflict with this? Ethical hedonism would say you have every right to be happy, but then all of a sudden you look at marriage, okay, we can be down with the better part, but for worse, well, that was not going to make me what? Happy. For richer, which is good, makes me happy. For poor, it's not going to make me happy. In sickness, oh boy, I have to put up with you vomiting on me, right? No. Health is okay. That makes me happy. To love and to cherish, till what? Death do us part. Now, I like that part if you're going to be there for me, but for me to be there for you at your deathbed, that would not make me happy. So you see how ethical hedonism goes the way of objecting and conflicting with our marriage vows that we have. So, to review, nihilism does what? It rejects the sacred, leaving us with mankind. Platonism divides mankind into body and soul, rejects the realities of biology. Okay? And then hedonism takes the soul and says that the soul's main goal and purpose is pleasure and happiness. Okay? So let's summarize. We're kind of summarizing the philosophy of our culture. What are the philosophical underpinnings at work in our culture and within the mindset of same-sex marriage advocates? How would we summarize them? What are the 3? Let's go through the 3. Number 1 is nihilism. Number 2, Platonism, or the effects of Platonism, we would say. And number 3 is ethical hedonism. So let's look at this here, the 3 of them. Nihilism is a rejection of authority and absolutes in regard to human sexuality, marriage, and so forth. Okay? So there's no objective standard or objective person or thing outside of us that defines what marriage and what sexuality and the way that truth works. There's no such thing as that outside of us. It's nihilism. Number 2, a rejection of sexual biology as a source of authority. The soul is what matters, so the body does not matter. In the case with Bruce Jenner, he said in his interview with Diane Sawyer, he said, if I can remember the quote, it doesn't really make sense, but he said, it's my brain and my soul are more female. So he's appealing to his soul as the basis of his sexuality, not his biological makeup. And we talked last week about the individual, the high school student, wanting to go into the girls' bathroom, right? And he says that he is a female, and people are rejecting that, and they say, well, you're bigoted. But the reality is, it's not that they're rejecting the soul, this is rejecting his biological makeup, okay? All right? But in our society, there's a rejection of understanding what sex you are on the basis of your biology. It's on the basis of your soul. Your realized gender is what they're saying. Make sense? No, it doesn't make sense, but you understand, right? Okay? It doesn't make you happy. Speaking of being happy, number 3, the ideology at work is the embracement of happiness and pleasure as the highest ideal and the goal of life. So that's at work. There is an ethic, I guess you would say, or there is a motive in our culture right now, and that is ethical hedonism, which is the highest ideal is pleasure and happiness. So this is what's governing the mindset of our culture. This is what's governing the mindset of same-sex marriage advocates. Okay? So let me just share with you why this is so important. What we have come to call the same-sex marriage debate is not, hear me out here, it is not directly about homosexuality, but about a change in philosophical assumptions concerning life, the world, ethics, truth, and ourselves. The debate is also not mainly about homosexuality, but about what marriage is and is not. The debate is not about whom we let marry, but about what marriage is and its purpose. There's much bigger things at stake to this than just same-sex marriage. There's a whole ideological framework at work beneath the surface. We are at a crossroads of 2 different ideologies that have been at tension for decades. We are at the crossroads of 2 different definitions of marriage derived from 2 different philosophical perspectives or philosophical frameworks. Does that make sense? So what we're seeing is the tip of the iceberg. And beneath, you have these, what they would say, tectonic plates that are shifting and moving and grinding. Okay? And those tectonic plates are the 3 things that I've pointed out to you. Nihilism, which is the rejection of the sacred, rejection of absolutes. Platonism, the effects of Platonism, which is the rejection of our biological makeup, what biology, what our bodies say about who we are, sexually speaking. And also an embracement of hedonism and the pursuit of happiness as the highest ideal. That is what is at work beneath the surface. So I want to take some time to compare the 2 definitions of marriage. And this is where the rubber meets the road. As you do, you can see the different philosophical presuppositions at work. I want to see if you can see the different presuppositions at work. How do we define traditional marriage? Okay, we're going to read this to you here. This is a definition of traditional marriage on the left, and here's a definition of a revisionist view of marriage. Let's read the one on the left here. Traditional marriage has long informed the law and has been depicted in art, religion, literature, and so forth. It is viewed as God's design for bodily, emotional, and spiritual bond of a husband and wife sealed by sexual intercourse. It is viewed as a comprehensive institution inherently ordered to the procreation and the raising and rearing of children. It is viewed as a permanent and exclusive commitment until death, regardless of life circumstances. It is an objective structure which is inherently good for us to live in, even when the going gets tough. Furthermore, the coming together of a bride and groom does not make a marriage, but rather a bride and groom step into marriage. The bride and groom are received into the estate of marriage as it is God's design and gift for mankind. Okay, that makes sense? Now let's compare that. How do we define a revisionist view of marriage? The revisionist view understands marriage as a union of persons who commit to romantic partnership and domestic life, essentially an emotional union merely enhanced by whatever sexual activity the partners find agreeable. Otherwise stated, in essence, it is a loving emotional bond, one distinguished by its intensity, happiness, and pleasure. A bond that doesn't need to point beyond the partners. Marriage's fidelity and trustworthiness is ultimately subject to the partner's own desires. Okay? So what are the differences here? So take some time and compare the two definitions. When the word marriage is used, are there different meanings of marriage in our country? How do we define? What struck you as different between those two definitions? Yeah? You notice the one on the left, the traditional view, appeals to biology. You notice it has husband and wife, male, female. It also talks about the procreation of children, right? To have the procreation of children, you need to have a male and a female, right? So it appeals to biology. It appeals to marriage as an institution or an estate created by God, something that mankind walks into, right? Husband and wife walk into, okay? It also talks about till death do you part, right? In good times and bad, richer for poor, okay? In other words, when I do premarital counseling, I always tell the premarital people, I say, you know what, marriage, you're not always going to be happy, right? I'll say to Serenity, okay, if I can be vulnerable with our fights, which I usually lose at, as I should, we'll sometimes say to each other, you're going to sit down and you're going to hear me out, and you're going to listen to this, and I know this is uncomfortable, but you need to hear me out, and we're going to work through this because you are married to me. And you're stuck with me, right? So we're going to deal with this. And there have been times where we look at each other and say, you know, she'll say to me, I don't really like you right now. And I would say, I don't like you either. But we're married to each other and we have to work this out, right? Okay? Right, Ren? Yes, right. Okay? So what we see in here at work, we see that marriage is an institution of God, right? It is bigger than us. There's something that defines marriage, right? The Lord defines marriage. It also appeals to biology, our makeup, sexually speaking, for the procreation of children. And it also basically says that it doesn't matter if you're always happy. It's good to be in it whether or not you feel happy or not. It's good for family. It's good for the raising of children. It's good for society. Okay? All right. Now, we're not talking cases of abuse, right? So those are the exception to the norm. So that's a whole different ballgame when you have maybe a woman who's being slapped around and beat up by her husband. That is a totally different situation. How about on this side here? The revisionist view understands the marriage union as persons, not appealing to biology, and it's committed to a romantic partnership. Nothing about the procreation of children. Okay. And generally speaking, it is leaning towards an emotional bond that's defined by happiness, and then sex is basically a cherry on top, and it's whatever they agree to as an enhancement to the romantic relationship. So sex in a revisionist view of marriage is an end to itself, right? So sex is done for pleasure, whereas here, in the traditional marriage, sex is done for pleasure, but also for the end means of the procreation of little ankle biters, right? Children. Okay? Okay, questions to consider. We're going to go an extra 5 minutes here, okay? If marriage is defined by the traditional sense, is it theoretically and actually possible to have a same-sex marriage? Yes or no? Theoretically, same-sex marriage is not technically possible if you define marriage according to the traditional sense. They can't get married, okay? If marriage is defined by the revisionist ideology, is it theoretically and actually possible to have a same-sex marriage? Yes. How about having a throuple? Now, if you define it, right, between two persons, can you still have a marriage with a throuple, which is 3 persons? According to the revisionist view of marriage, you could actually technically have a throuple, which would be 3 people in marriage, if you define it on emotional bonds. Okay? If we recognize marriage as a society, according to the revisionist definition, should same-sex couples be allowed to marry? If we recognize marriage underneath the revisionist view, then technically speaking, yes. That answer would be yes. If we recognize marriage as a society according to the traditional sense, should same-sex couples be allowed to marry? No. That makes sense? Can you see how at the root of the argument is the definition of what marriage is? Can you see how at the root of the definition of marriage is different philosophical underpinnings of truth, biology, and the purpose of life? Depending on how we define marriage is going to be dependent upon what philosophical underpinnings we have at work and what those different ideologies at work are going to define what marriage is, and how we define marriage is going to define who can marry and so forth. So real briefly here, there's a war on the word marriage, okay? So marriage has actually been redefined in our society, okay? Changing the definition of marriage from a conjugal understanding, that is what? For the procreation of children, based upon on a male and female, right? For sex, for the procreation of children. Okay, changing the definition of marriage from the conjugal understanding to the revisionist understanding was an important goal of the same-sex lobby, but it was not its main goal. The primary objective was the normalization of same-sex relationships through legal and societal recognition. Changing the definition of marriage, first implicitly, then explicitly, was both a means to this end and a byproduct of it. This is by Robin Phillips. One of the reasons it was so easy to impose the revisionist understanding on both America and Great Britain, is because the groundwork had already been laid in the middle of the last century when marriage ceased to be understood as organically connected to procreation. When you've been treating marriage as little more than a romantic relationship between 2 persons for about 60 years, it becomes difficult to really appreciate why gender dimorphism or complementarity is essential rather than accidental to marriage. Even so, this should not minimize the significance of the fact that the revisionist definition is now being formally imposed. Okay? So, but does this really matter? Why should we be concerned that dictionaries are changing the definition of marriage, as long as we know what they mean by it? We should be concerned because the way we define words changes how we think about each other and the world itself. Neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists are discovering that speech does not merely proceed from our thoughts like a one-way street. There's also a traffic flowing in the other direction. How we speak affects how we think about the world on a level that our conscious minds may never even be aware. So how we speak about marriage shapes and forms us. Okay? So let's just conclude real quick here. What these and many other scholars are trying to help us realize is that language doesn't just describe what we think about the world. It is also a lens by which we understand and interpret the world around us, often without even realizing it. That is why we should be concerned about the uncritical acceptance of the new revisionist definition of marriage throughout English-speaking culture. It isn't just a matter of semantics, but it involves an entirely different understanding of relationships, family, and even what it means to be human. That makes sense? There's a war on the word of marriage, and there's actually 2 definitions of marriage in our culture. So, we're going to summarize here. There are different philosophical underpinnings at odds beneath the same-sex marriage debate, right? What are the different philosophical movements that we've identified? Nihilism, the effects of Platonism, and ethical hedonism. Those are the 3 that I've identified that are at work underneath. These different philosophical presuppositions led to different definitions of marriage. The different definitions of marriage actually impact the fabric of society as well as many other aspects of life. And how that definition of marriage is fleshed out is what is at the heart of the most recent ruling by the what? Supreme Court. So when we say marriage, When we say marriage, we have to ask the question, what do you mean by marriage? How do you define marriage? And I can guarantee you that at the root of the same-sex marriage debate, those that would actually be advocates of a same-sex marriage would not define marriage according to what we've discussed here, what the traditional sense is. They can't. So at the heart of this is two different definitions of marriage with two different sets of presuppositions at work. That make sense? So the two tips of the iceberg are colliding, but underneath you have fundamentally different presuppositions, fundamentally different assumptions about life, about sexuality, about the purpose of life, and the author of life. Okay? We're way over, but any pressing questions that can't wait? So where we're going is we've talked about the philosophy. Next we're going to talk about the theology. What is our theology of sexuality? And those that embrace same-sex marriage, what is their theology? How do they make it work? We're going to take a bunch of Bible passages and show how we understand those Bible passages and how they understand them. And then finally, we're going to talk about the impact. What impact is that going to have on our society? What impact is that going to have on us as a church? What impact is that going to have for our children and our children's children and so forth?